So, in search of shelter, the politics of the implementation of ULCRA 1976 by Harini Narayanan.
Wait, so on this screen is not appearing.
It is showing. Okay. I will just share this. Now?
Yeah, it's appearing now.
So, in search of shelter, the politics of the implementation of ULCRA 1976 by Harini Narayanan. In early March 1999, the lower house of the Indian Parliament approved the repeal of the Urban Land Ceiling and Regulation Act ULCRA 1976. The ULCRA was passed in February 1976, but its origins can be traced to various campaign documents and statements generated by the Congress Party from the early 1960s onwards. The ULCRA was eventually enacted virtually overnight with no parliamentary debate at the height of the emergency. The act eventually failed, at least in part because its social welfare aims were impossible to achieve because the pursuit of these aims somehow bred a degree of corruption and venality that crippled and distorted the very purpose of the act. The paper is divided into four sections. The first offers an introduction to the ULCRA and presents the central argument of the second is the act which demonstrate how
We lost
powerful
then,
lobbies.
just repeat that last sentence again.
Which one? Oh,
You just said what you just said. Last 10 seconds maybe.
yeah, the paper is divided into four sections. The first offers introduction to the ULCRA and presents the central argument of the paper. The second discusses the scope and achievements of the Act in the Greater Mumbai area. The third seeks to demonstrate how powerful lobbies have benefited from the workings of the Act. The fourth section focuses on the provision of affordable housing that has been pursued by the government in Greater Mumbai over time. Like everything else associated with this controversial piece of legislation, the announcement of the repeal came after much acrimonious debate and dissent amongst all those concerned or affected by the Act. In Maharashtra, the state government had, after much discussion, accepted a resolution to rescind the Act, but had immediately also decided that it would replace the central ULCRA with a law of its own. Though India has a multitude of land use laws and policies that purport to ensure a base level of shelter for all citizens, the two, that is the legislative framework and complementary policy instruments, has a set of tools that can actually result in concrete and dramatic changes on the ground. The Act is sometimes believed was brought into force only with a view to soften the impact of the emergency. The Act was set up from the very outset to defeat or bypass its stated socialist aims, and in this respect, it actually achieved spectacular success. Those who had the skill and wherewithal to manipulate the provisions of the Act managed to ensure that urban development continued, and any property price rises could conveniently be blamed on the ULCRA.
The ULC, yes, I'm telling. The ULCRA Mumbai, the historical perspective. It would useful to look at the scope, actual achievement of the ULCRA of the Greater Mumbai level. The data analyzed here relate to the period between the enhancement of the Act and March 1999, when the ULCRA was repealed of the national level, declaring landholding were filled at the Greater Mumbai level. 57% filled statement covering almost 26,000 hectare of land had been scrutinized by early 1999. The process of acquisition proved to be a cumbersome. The Act stipulated that the maximum amount payable by the state for a land no more than rupees 2 lakh. The Maharashtra government periodically different formulas were used to allow landowners to seek exemption for up to 70%. They stood to laws of the agreed to surrender the rest free of cost of the government. The land thus obtained by the government was generally handed over the Maharashtra Housing and Area Development Authority. MHADA gained possession of almost 65 of the 70.5 hectare acquired under this act in the Greater Mumbai area. There are no price control on these flats. There is a little difference between them and similar units created by private sources. So हम slide change करना. Hello.
Change झाली.
Apart from a land which is mainly used for the purpose of agriculture, ULCRA 1992-5, the Act's major exemption clauses permitted the government to free land. It was necessary or expedient in the public interest so to do, or it is satisfied. Undue hardship to the erstwhile owner, Section 20 ULCRA 1992-20. Similarly, the sections are made and also weaker section 20 and 21. Over the year, the ULCRA has given rise to some landmark uses at the national level. Famous Shanti Star Builders versus Gautami and other 1990 case that originated in a Greater Mumbai.
So who does ULCRA really benefit? One of the most surprising beneficiaries of the act were the landowners themselves, and they kept it that way by not attracting any media attention. For instance, even when the act was first introduced and they stood to lose out big, they never protested the act. One of the main reasons for their silence was that ULCRA was less draconian than its predecessor, the Central Land Acquisition Act. The amount of ambiguity and flexibility that ULCRA offered really made it easy to exploit, and this was fully utilized by the landowners. For example, they realized that any land with existing construction on it could be exempt from surrender. So they actually encouraged encroachments on their plots. Developers were okay with the extra cost of demolition given the premium value of land in Mumbai. The only people who lost out, ironically, were the very people the act was supposed to help, who ended up being evicted as soon as construction on the land began. Mentioned on the slide are a variety of other loopholes, all of which were fully exploited by the landowners to their advantage. However, the least tedious and most profitable one of them was the last one. Landowners often sold their land before they had to surrender it to the government. Large parcels of excess land couldn't be sold under ULCRA, but they got around that by selling smaller contiguous plots of land, which fell under the ceiling limits to individual members of cooperative societies with the help of developers. The next beneficiaries were the big builders. Were the big builders, and who incidentally were among ULCRA's most vocal critics. They worked in sync with the government and lobbied many schemes that the government later announced as liberal and market-friendly opportunities. One such scheme was guided development. It involved the builders selling their land for 1 rupee per hectare and leasing it back from the government for 80 years at a rate of 1 rupee per year. They developed this land and sold it back for 150 rupees per square feet, which is not like a bad price at all. And in turn, they got their entire land exempt under Section 20. Construction was also at an all-time high during this period, right when the developers were blaming ULCRA for a freeze, which they attributed to the exponential rise in real estate prices in the city. Next slide.
The next major beneficiary were the industries. So the industries were given a slew of benefits, and the government made sure not to jeopardize the privileged status of land given to industry in the country. One of the most important was Section 23, which stated that industry owners could hold excess ceiling land if they declared that they would use it for industry or employee housing. They also allowed the owners to indefinitely extend their time period. They also received exemption from the previously discussed Section 20's personal hardship and public interest clause, which gave almost half a hectare in the Greater Mumbai area and 1 hectare in other urban areas. The owners are also allowed to mortgage their lands, so to without any special permissions to raise capital for the industries. Even in case law, it has been noted that industry requirements have been equated to social good, to the social good. sometimes even more than the housing of up to 50 to 100 people. The case law has also granted special permissions for grants for redevelopment of bankrupt industries. But perhaps the most important, that is Section 22, as previously stated, allows redevelopment for encroached or demolished lands. This section simple wording was abused by landowners when the cotton textile mills were freed, when Mumbai's cotton textile mills were freed up in the 1990s. This led to a staggered declaration of land surpluses to the government as and when the development plan changed and evolved and the areas were freed up for commercial and residential purposes. This led to a very small amount of land actually being surrendered to the governments for building for building houses for the lower class. Next slide. So, uh, government at the state and central levels. So it has to be noted that the very act of granting exemption is an act of powerful political patronage. Not only that, but it used to be that the CM would get access to 10% of the surrendered flats. Although this was reduced to 5% following public scrutiny, several projects like the spacious flats on Malabar Hills, which was meant for economically backward classes, actually went into the hands of politicians as expensive residential areas. Even the rate of granting exemptions had varied in large margins according to the acting CM at the time. For example, Sharad Pawar cleared over 200 applications in a single year, whereas his successor A.R. Antole cleared only 2 applications in 2 years. The next in line, Babasaheb Bhosle didn't clear a single application until several months when he rose into power. Eventually frustrated by this, the Architectural Engineering and Town Planners Association petitioned that applications under Section 21 to be cleared henceforth. This cleared up 17,000 square meter land parcel in Worli and a 50,000 square meter land parcel in Parel. It is to be noted that these exemptions and petitions always came along when property prices were hit and the property market was in a bad state. So the government actually artificially pumped the prices of properties by freeing up land parcels. So the lands of Mumbai were actually warped by the market and political ideologies rather than actually focusing on the initial goal of providing habitation for the lower class population. Next slide.
When the state was failing miserably at acquiring and developing land under ULCRA, it was doing the same very successfully by acquiring land for CIDCO. As you can see here, the differences in the amount of land acquired and used in both cases are staggering. Government-led construction on the little land it acquired has almost ground to zero, but the private construction of mostly unaffordable homes has drastically increased. The Maharashtra Housing and Development Board has created lesser than 8,000 plots, and almost none of them went to those belonging to the economically weaker sections. And all of the tenements they constructed were bought by people in the higher income group. So the concept of subsidized housing lost all its meaning in the process. Additionally, instead of being conscious of speculative pricing, the board itself has gotten carried away and has been guilty of pricing its flats phenomenally high. Next slide. Many other state governments have done a better job at utilizing ULCRA for the betterment of its people, which only further highlights the point that housing shortfall in Mumbai is due to its unaffordability and not due to its unavailability. An integration of the existing tools is needed to enable the construction of affordable housing. Concessional financing schemes for the development of mass low-cost housing like the Indira Awas Yojana have seen some success in the past. HUDCO has been working on developing alternative construction technologies which can help significantly lower building expenses. Also, as mentioned earlier, the state government has the ability to acquire any land it desires, regardless of whether or not it is private. Even if it doesn't want to utilize the vast tracts of public sector land it owns, it has access to land surrendered by bankrupt industries such as the cotton mills. Some of this already owned land can be utilized for the development of housing. Even just enforcing rules can go a long way in improving the conditions. For instance, following the existing legislation which mandates housing for workers employed by an industry and expanding it to include a more significant percent of the workforce. There are plenty of other tools available, but until the fundamental problems related to implementation of existing housing schemes are addressed and amended, the existence of ULCRA or any other similar laws just serves as a mean of control and profiteering with no actual impact on the lives of the homeless. Thank you.
Okay, good. Thanks. Let's do the other presentation also, and then we'll see both of them. We'll discuss both of them together.
I'll just share my screen. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. Today, my group and I will be discussing Darrell de Monte's paper on the redevelopment of Mumbai's cotton textile mill lands. So what was the reason for the decline of the cotton textile mills? Mill owners had lost their will to run mills and resorted to selling or developing their land to earn bigger revenues. And schemes that were approved by the BIFR favored rehabilitation of mills rather than disposal of assets so that the workers were not left jobless. However, due to the lack of monitoring the scheme, owners resorted to subterfuge in order to dispose their land, workers, and assets on the pretext of modernizing their mills. So, what were the consequences? The largest unionized labor force was reduced to one-third of its original strength. Several skyscrapers sprouted in a predominantly working class area. There was a decline of population in the municipal wards. The gentrification of the entire area known as Girgaon also led to the deindustrialization of Mumbai's mills. The paper sort of proposes an alternate solution for this. Instead of
Hello.
allowing. Hello.
Girangaon, not Girgaon, huh? Girgaon
Girangaon.
is.
I'm so sorry. Girangaon, yes. Um, So the paper proposes an alternate solution for this. Instead of allowing a plot-by-plot scale, the state government could have ensured that a holistic view was taken of the entire area and a policy framed for its overall use. A revival of the mill as a modernized plant would retain many existing workers. For those rendered jobless, there should be an adequate compensation, unlike the voluntary retirement schemes which provide minimum benefits. Instead, or in addition, one-third of the land which was to be surrendered to the MHADA could be turned over for low-cost housing to the workers. In some instances, there may be no need to demolish the mills but to redeploy them instead. Since villains would not be able to retain such occupations, the jobs could be offered to the children or relatives. And by such redevelopment, the heartland of Mumbai would retain its working class character, even as mills modernized on their lands, and visually the social heritage of the city would be retained. Atrophy of the textile industry. So by 1931, almost half the population of Mumbai was dependent on the textile industry. However, it faced a decline by 1970s. In 1982 to 83, there was an 18-month-long strike which resulted in the loss of about 1 lakh jobs. In 1991, the Congress began the process of economic liberalization, which resulted in the delicensing of the textile industry. The state government amended its DC rules, under which land was deemed surplus once a scheme for rehabilitation of the mills was approved by the BIFR in New Delhi. Under this formula, one-third of the land is to be surrendered to the BMC for public amenities, one-third to the MHADA for public housing, and the rest was for the mill owner to sell or develop. In 1996, the Maharashtra government appointed the committee under Charles Correa to drop an integrated development plan for the surplus cotton textile mill lands. And in 1997, there was an opposition from textile workers against the sale of land. The Maharashtra Chief Minister announced that he proposed to amend the DC rules further to provide a quarter instead of a third, with the workers being the new beneficiary. However, he also proposed that the owners would receive a higher FSI on this land. So what happened after? A new case was made for the sale of land by companies. Often companies own considerable vacant land within the factory premises which are unutilized by firms. Their sale could generate a substantial additional fund for repaying the whole or a part of the outstanding debt and also for meeting the costs of rationalizing the workforce.
In 1991, employment was 5.9 lakh, which was particular sector. Total between 1881 to 1981 to 1991, there was a decline in population in Parel by 1.5%, Elphinstone by 0.3%, and Sandhurst by 2.2%. The BIFR. The sale of all the mills and was only permitted by the BIFR's approval. It brought many organizations in a single frame, such as the SBI, IDBI, Tax and Excise Authority, Central and State Government, Commercial Bank, Electricity Board, etc. Yeah, next slide. GKSS was a trade union organization. They highlighted the point that once a level of land was approved, it goes through a land sale where there is no follow-up on the implementation. Owner sells it to the highest bidder, and there is no guarantee that the bidder will use the mill to produce the textile. It's lost on two accounts. One is by exploiting the advantage to revive the mill, and second is to there never will be a land extending 2.8 square kilometers to redevelop in one chunk. Next slide. The previous Congress government under the Chief Minister Sharad Pawar had permitted 9 mill owners to sell their lands, but this was halted after an unexpected crime with Khatau mill owner. Sunit Khatau was murdered in May 1994, who wanted to sell the Khatau mill plot in Baikala and wanted to move to a larger unit in Borivali. Sunit Khatau used the services of Arun Gavli to infiltrate the mill unions to pressurize the workers into moving to the northern suburbs. Amar Nayak, fearing that that Gavli would get a cut on the 250 crore deal, he exterminated Sunit Khatau before the deal. Next slide. The Shriram Mill case study. During 82 and 83 strikes, Shriram Mill had around 6,000 employees. In 1991, it was declared sick under the SICA. In 1991, it submitted a revival scheme to the BIFR. Eventually, the mill was to be rehabilitated without retrenching many workers. New machines were to be installed and the modernization was to be completed in next 2 years. But how would it be funded? So they were going to sell and redevelop around 1.2 lakh square feet of land to raise around 1 to 1.2 crores. Next slide. There were concessions offered to the promoters. So the financial institutions and the banks were to waive the penal interest and liquidated damages. The interest of 6% was to be charged on loans and then the normal 10%. Maharashtra government was to waive the interest on penalties on account of non-payment of the sales and the electricity dues. The BMC was to reschedule the outstanding dues on water charges, property tax and waive interest. The central government also agreed to exempt the company from certain provisions of the Income Tax Act. Next slide. So does the revival scheme actually get implemented? No, it doesn't get implemented. Once it was sanctioned, most of the department was just closed down. No modernization was carried out and workers were left to sit idle. During this part of the processing department was demolished to create the surplus land and the workers were shifted to the another department and made idle again. Next slide. So what happens to these mill workers and the cleared out land? In 93-94, around 2,000 workers were pressurized to submit the resignation, and this was totally against the spirit of the scheme. Out of fear that they might lose what is legally theirs, like the provident fund and stuff like that, many workers submitted their resignations in a single day. The surplus area, which was gained from the demolition of the processing department of the mill, was sold without even setting up the sales and the asset committee, which they are also required to do so.
Yeah, scheme of 1994, which was sanctioned by Appellate Authority for Industrial Finance and Reconstruction, in which they emphasized few points, which were one-time settlement of the dues, sale of surplus land, partial modernization of the plant, and many more were presented. The impact of the mill owners was the weaving department was completely shut down. Number of employees came down to 1450. And also, according to GKSS, the things are unfair to the workers and they decided to file a case in labor court. Yeah, next slide. After filing the case in labor court, the petition against the sanction scheme was also filed in the High Court. Seeing the scenario, the company filed a special leave petition in Supreme Court. It allowed the company to implement the scheme but stayed the sale of land. The High Court was directed to hear the parties and hence the matter was referred back to it. Next slide. Shri Ram Kamgar Sangathan came in image and the president of SRKS signed a settlement with the management without referring it to GKSS. After GKSS set a general body meeting and requested the workers not to accept the VRS for rupees 1 lakh per worker, but the workers expressed their desire to accept the compensation, at which the GKSS stated that they could not support the workers in such a decision and hence withdraw the case. Next slide. Then back in 1996, a modified scheme by management has been proposed, which results in increased capital expenditure. Also, the compensation given to the workers was raised by 45 crores in total. Next slide. Earlier in March 1996, the company had leased around 8,000 square feet to Awadh State Services as a business center at a lease rent of rupees 60 square feet per 60 per square feet a month. And at that time, assumption has been made by AAFIR that the company would take up the activity on a large scale and would lease out a built up area of about 20,000 square feet from various parties. Next slide. Seeing this table, we can clearly get that how the number of workers decreases from year 1991 to 1996. Next slide. Later in 1997 and 1998, the company started buying 60% of the yarn from outside the mill, and the result was that there would now only be 85 permanent workers and another 104 on contract. At each successive stage or scheme, the cost of the revival scheme was hiked up, and the functioning of each department was progressively dismantled. Seeing this, it came to the conclusion that the only object of the entire exercise was to convert a large amount of mill land space as a business center.
Yeah, so the holistic approach of the rehabilitation, the draft development plan of MMRDA undergoes decline in the employment in the Greater Mumbai. It pioneered development of the key industries in the country such as textile, chemical, light engineering, electronics, etc., and generated sizable employment and the national income. So, however, the ongoing rehabilitation of the cotton textile mills, the city's erstwhile leading industry, does not amount to such recycling because they are not even being replaced by other employment intensive, environment friendly industries, which the plan advocates. Next slide. The manifestation of such policy is already evident with high-rise apartments and the office blocks. This is the second and related opportunity for which is being lost by redevelopment of textile mill land. Never again will Mumbai's planners be presented with so much land, which is 280 hectares, being put up for the reuse in block. That's why these questions arises. The first claim to such land. Next slide. So the problem with 1/3 formula adopted by the development control rules is that it given short shrift to workers. It assumes that VRS is an adequate instrument of compensation. VRS is voluntary retirement scheme where an employee is offered to voluntarily retire from services before the retirement date. Benefits of VRS is right sizing manpower has become an important management strategy. Today, due to the intense competition, VRS regarded as most human technique that firms can use to reduce staff. Owner's first responsibility is to modernize at least some sections which can continue to make a profit, where both owners and state could intervene effectively, is to provide opportunities for re-employment for those workers who cannot absorb instead of offering them VRS. The most obvious way to do this would be to hand over looms to those in the weaving department, encourage them to form cooperatives, ensure that they obtain yarn and fixed price for clothes they produce. They would then be continuing in an occupation with which they are familiar, though in a changed set of circumstances. Next slide. So it is important not just create more jobs but also to ensure that decent wage levels are maintained. One obvious option is the garment manufacturing with an intervention that may meet such objections is to offer a mill workers the choice of assigning a job in a new industry to his child instead, who is more likely to possess the basic education and language skills required for it. So the report seeks to take holistic view of the vacant land so that they can be clubbed for their different uses, commercial, social, and the public. Next slide. To reconcile three generally conflicting interests of the owners, workers, and the publics is by no means easy to accomplish. It will call for great deal of the transparency. So the first need is to freeze any further sale of land. Then the state should simultaneously compel private owners to grant committee access to its mills so that various possibilities regarding consolidation of land and meaningful redevelopment could be recommended. Next slide.
Done?
Yeah, we're done.
Okay. All right. So lots of ground to cover here, but let's start with it's important to begin, I think, by thinking a little bit about the model of industrialization that was chosen by the Indian state planners post-independence. And this developmental model is called import substitution industry, which is contrasted with export-led industry or industrialization. So import substitution industrialization basically means that what the state does, what the Indian state did is, I mean, we all know, for instance, that a large part of the core industry or the sectors of industry which are what is called natural monopolies, steel or resource extraction and so on, those were essentially controlled by the state, right? So a large part of the core industries were state enterprises in India post-independence. And then you also have private capital in things like textiles and cloth manufacturing and so on. But what the import substitution industry does is that it levies quite a lot of controls in terms of excise duties and tariffs on trade and so on, which protects the local capitalists from foreign competition. So the import substitute, because what it does is it assures these local producers a market within the country. So typically the way it works is that there will be a great deal of protections in terms of border controls and so on, where foreign goods, if they have to enter the country, have to actually pay a huge amount of taxation and tariffs, so that when they come into the domestic market, their prices are so high that they essentially cannot compete with local goods, locally produced goods. So the local capitalists get, in a way, protection from the state for their, and they virtually become oligopolies, very few manufacturers, because there's also licenses and so on. So these licenses restrict the amount of firms which are producing, and those producers are then shielded from foreign competition. So that creates a certain kind of assured market. That's why you had very little very few companies making very few different kinds of goods, and that's why you had fewer models of cars and fewer kind of fewer companies manufacturing textiles and so on. So this was the model that was chosen by the Indian planners. Now the other option that was chosen, let's say, by countries like South Korea, is called the export-led industry, where the state does not protect the local capitalists from competition, from foreign competition, but in a sense supports local capitalists to be able to advance technologically and so on, to compete with goods abroad. In fact, it seeks markets even outside the country, not just within the country, right? I mean, there are, there's a lot of literature on the pros and cons of all of this. But basically what happened in India, obviously, is that because of this import substitution industry, there was no real incentive for local capitalists to modernize their production technologies. So a large part of the textile mills that were in Bombay, for instance, did not improve their technological capacities and so on. And that is what is referred to sometimes as the sickness of mills. Now, the mills didn't get sick, obviously, because there was no demand or any such thing. It was basically that they had no incentive to develop or modernize. Now, what also happened is that there's a very interesting story of, we all know this, that in Bombay, land is basically the key source of most urban politics. And I mean, it's pretty much everywhere, but in Bombay, it's especially acute because being an island city, peninsular city, and so on, coastal city, there are constraints of how much the city can expand and so forth. And what also happened is that at some point in the history of the city post-independence, the textile mill owners, the industrial capitalists of Bombay, realized that the land on which they have their mills have greater potential as real estate. So the rents that they could get from land by developing land into, I don't know, malls or commercial complexes or high-end residential and so on, they could basically profit more than to run industry and make profits through industry. So the moment you find that the possibility of exploiting land is greater than being an industrial capitalist, there is going to be a incentive to try to move in that direction. And so obviously that is something that happened, and because of that prospect, even the little bit of modernization that the industry that the capitalists were doing before that, they had no reason to continue with that, right? And so what happens as a result is that now, if you look at the city's working class population, the industries in Bombay had a substantially large organized workforce. And at one point, in fact, almost 1/3 of the working age population in Bombay was directly or indirectly benefiting from the industries in the city. It was a fairly large urban workforce, and a large part of the city's culture as a working class culture with a strong organized labor movement and so on was also reflected. And that's the reason why this Bombay city was always considered a cosmopolitan, or was a cosmopolitan city, because you also had a fairly lively working class culture. Obviously, as we saw in the chapter on Shiv Sena, that after the rise of the Shiv Sena and the decline of the mills, which happened parallelly, much of this cosmopolitanism began to get eroded. And today the city is, organized spatially as well as socially. It is quite fragmented, and has become more nativist in that sense, more driven by identity politics rather than class politics. You can see that, and that has to do with the decline of industry. So the consequences of a shift from industry to real estate and finance is not just the fact that working people are more precarious, more vulnerable, also more less protected, but it's also that culturally the city changes quite a bit. So that's important to bear in mind. Now, when we come to the land story of the mill lands, and the first reading was on Urban Land Ceiling Act, and it's an important context to understanding the mill land dispute as well, right? So what is the mill land dispute? Now, the mill lands were not the lands of the mill owners anyway, to begin with. So the way in which mills came up in the city of Bombay was that these lands were leased by the colonial government in the 1860s, or from the 1860s onwards, to capitalists to be able to run industry. Now, why would they do that? The reason they would do that is because land is a expensive resource, right? What the state wanted to do at that time was to set up industry in the city, become an important industrial center. But what they did was they leased out these lands at low rents to the capitalists to run industry or to set up their shop. And a lot of the profits that the older elite in the city made through commerce, through opium and cotton trade and so on, were then reinvested in industry, right? That's how the industries came up in the city. Once you had industry, you had industry also needs labor, and so large population of workers migrated to the city and became the industrial workforce. Now, so it's important to remember that the land was never private. The land was always state land leased to private owners. Okay. Now what happens? How does this land suddenly become private land? And that's the biggest mystery in this whole story. Now, there was a particular conundrum for the mill owners. If land is private, if land is privately owned in the city, and it is not industry, Okay, so as we saw in the first essay, the Urban Land Ceiling Act mentioned that, stated that if you have land, privately owned land surplus of 500 square meters, more than 500 square meters, you have to surrender that land to the government so that the government can build low-income housing. It's a land redistribution law. Okay, it's a very, I mean, at least in spirit, if not in practice, it was a progressive law because it was meant to redistribute land. Now, if land is privately owned and it is not industrial land and it is not no development zone land, then that land has to be acquired beyond 500 square meters, has to be acquired by the owner, from the owner, and used for housing or public amenities and whatever. The problem for the mill owners was that so the zoning, so the land use zoning of industry in the heartland of Bombay was important because it allowed the mill owners to keep their land even though it was not owned by them. Now, through when this during this the development plan made in the 80s and 90s, this zoning was removed. Basically, there was a flexible zonings that was introduced, which meant that lands need not be redeveloped for industry. They could become non-industrial, commercial, or residential, and so on. Which would mean that the if that land is privately owned, it would be acquired. Right now, the owners were arguing on the one hand that this land is private. Okay, but if that land was private, and the moment they pulled down the industrial buildings from that land became vacant, and then it was available for the state to acquire for other uses, right? So the mill owners had to do something very tricky. What they had to argue was that land is private, but they also had to make sure that it is not acquired under the Urban Land Ceiling Act. Now, in the mill land discussion, there was we all know about the Charles Correa proposal. In fact, KRBI was involved in the preparation of that 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 scheme, and so on. It is considered to be a very progressive scheme. However, even that scheme was highly limited, because if you think about it, what was that scheme? It said 1/3 of the land goes to the mill owners for whatever private use they want. 1/3 goes to open spaces or the BMC, and 1/3 goes to MHADA for public housing. Now, the question is, if there was the Urban Land Ceiling Act, which basically said anything surplus of 500 square meters goes to the state, under the Urban Land Ceiling Act, actually what the mill owners would get would be, say, 1/10 or 1/20th or sometimes even 1/50th of the land, not 1/3, right? So the 1/3 was already too much of a giveaway to the mill owners. Now, but the whole thing was on the assumption that this is privately owned land, which it was not. So the state could have simply said that this is public land, this is not privately owned, the leases stand cancelled. If you don't want to run industry on that land, your lease is cancelled. We acquire all of the land and we use it for the city's development, whether it's health, education, housing, or whatever, which the state obviously did not do. But it not only accepted the argument of the mill owners that it is privately owned, it also accepted that it is privately owned, but we will not implement the Urban Land Ceiling Act. Okay, now the mill land issue became very controversial when in the 90s there was a new DC rule introduced to divide the land 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, and the wording of that earlier regulation was that 1/3 of the mill lands would be divided up. The mill lands would be divided up into 3 parts. Later, that rule was amended, and one word was introduced in those new rules, which basically said 1/3 of the vacant land will be kept by the the vacant land will be subdivided into 3 parts. Now, the problem was that if you look at these mill buildings, they were very large footprint buildings. So vacant land was almost negligible, So basically, that simple change in the DC regulations meant that most of the mill lands would be kept by the mill owners, which is exactly what happened. Right? All of these things, there was in the 90s and 2000s, this was mill lands was the biggest kind of public issue in the city. And obviously, we all know what happened today. If you go to the erstwhile mill lands, you find skyscrapers and malls and all of that, and there are no workers to be seen, working class housing to be seen, there are no industries and so on. So basically the city was, there was what happened was daylight robbery in the city. In fact, now the only mill lands that are remaining are mill lands that are operated by the state, the NTC mills. Those lands are still in the possession of the government, and now the government is talking about one third of the state land redevelopment, which actually, I mean, it's already state land to begin with. So why would you subdivide, and why would the state keep one third of that? You know, I mean, so all of this is basically typical land politics in Bombay. But it is important for us to bear in mind this is the way in which the whole story unfolded, and it's quite a shocking thing that happened in the city. And incidentally, one of you mentioned during the presentation that there is no bigger land than the mill lands where this and no bigger opportunity. Actually, if you look at the docklands today, it's much bigger than the mill lands. The docklands are about 800 hectares. It all belongs to the central government, which actually is the custodian of the land. The land is public land. It belongs to you, me, and everybody else in the city. And it's going in a similar direction. So, history is going to repeat itself unless people do something about it. But unlike the mill lands, there is much less attention and much less discussion and debate about the docklands. When we come to the Urban Land Ceiling Act, I think it's important to bear in mind that the Urban Land Ceiling Act was introduced during the emergency. And during the emergency, actually, the Congress government carried out incredible amount of evictions in the city. It was brutal hardships that people faced. And in various ways. Actually, the emergency itself was one of the important reasons for imposing the emergency was because there was in 83, in fact, in 73, there was a very large railway strike in the city, in the country, which was brutally repressed by the Congress government. They sent in the paramilitary to repress the strike. There were lots of popular agitations, Jayaprakash Narayan movement, and so on. And basically, the country was becoming too democratic, which the Congress government couldn't stand. And so when ultimately Indira Gandhi's own election was questioned, and there were allegations of corruption during the elections, she imposed the emergency. And I mean, it was a highly extremely dark period in the country's history. And the emergency was also very brutal for the city's slum dwellers. A lot of people were evicted from the city, but and all of this, which obviously meant that the Congress government and Indira Gandhi especially had to do something to win back some kind of public trust. And the Urban Land Ceiling Act was supposedly this kind of land redistribution policy, which was meant to do that. But like any law that's passed at the central level, the rules for that law are made at the state level, right? And especially because the Urban Land Ceiling Act is a land act, land is a state subject. So the rules for the Urban Land Ceiling Act were made at the level of the state government, and the rules created a lot of exemptions for landowners. So even though the act seemed to be very, redistributionist, but actually it created so many loopholes for landowners and developers to exploit that in the end, the state managed to acquire very little land from this particular act, which is what the essay talks about. In fact, many landowners benefited from this act in one way or the other. So so that's basically the Urban Land Ceiling Act story. And the interesting thing about it is that despite that, it was highly unpopular in developmental circles. So, for instance, the World Bank, when it came in and started giving loans to the Maharashtra government for various kinds of housing schemes, the site and services schemes, and so on, one of the important conditions was the repeal of the Urban Land Ceiling Act. The point was that as long as such a law which has a redistributionist intent exists on paper, it is dangerous, because it means that people can say that private property is not sacrosanct, that the state can actually step in and redistribute land, which was seen as ideologically not a very good idea by the international financial institutions and so on. And so in 99, it was eventually repealed. Even though it was completely ineffectual, it was repealed nonetheless, because it's a bad idea, and bad ideas should not exist. So yeah, that's the so I mean, in fact, if the Land Ceiling Act was implemented, and if the state had actually enforced its own ownership over the mill lands, today Bombay would be a very different city. I mean, I was once 3 or 4 years ago, I was invited at this Godrej India Culture Labs for a talk, and they had invited that's fancy, very, very fancy facility where they all the artists of the city go and talk about all kinds of progressive things. And one of these sessions that they had organized was on housing, and they had called me for a talk there. And in fact, it was very funny, because I said that if in fact the Urban Land Ceiling Act was implemented, today this land where this Godrej India Culture Labs is would actually be public housing. And it was historical irony, in fact, that lavish facility, and in fact there is a large Godrej private housing scheme there. All of those things would not have happened. But today, in those spaces, those very spaces, artists and cultural practitioners organize talks about public housing in the city. So it's that's the irony, let's say. So the city would look very different if these laws were actually put in enforced, but they were not. And so what we see today is the result of that. Yeah. Okay. That's it. Anybody has questions or comments or things to add, please do. By the way, there was an important point also about the Hiranandani gardens. And this was that lease thing that was done. Basically, it was leased to Hiranand. That whole land was actually meant for public housing, or low income housing, in fact. What Hiranandani did was, it said that, look, we will make affordable housing on this land. So they were given that land for 1 rupee a square meter or something like that. And what they built was Hiranandani Gardens, as you can see. Funny thing is that there was a matter that went to court, and Ghar Bachao Ghar Banao Andolan took them to court. And the court, even the High Court, observed that, well, apparently the people who want to live in this affordable housing are very rich, the court sarcastically remarked. So anyway, so yeah, so I mean, Bombay is full of these land scams. So you just have to dig a little and you'll find tons of them. Yeah. Anyway, so another important thing is that the Urban Land Ceiling Act did not apply to the government, which is also interesting, because the biggest landowners in Bombay, currently the biggest landowner in Bombay is the central government in the form of the port lands and so on. So yeah. Okay. Any questions or comments? No, nothing. Is anybody there, or I'm talking to myself?
No, you are there. Yeah, we are here.
I'm there. I'm definitely there. I'm asking if you were there. Yeah. Any questions or anything to say?
What is the hello, Shivamya? The current situation of the DC with the mill lands that are with the state, like those are abandoned and just there. So what is the DC?
No, they are not all abandoned. In fact, there are some units that are still running. Many are abandoned also. And the recent, I think pre-COVID, there was an announcement by the state government that they're going to open them up as redevelop them with the 1/3 formula. But redeveloping state-owned land through the 1/3 formula is, again, I don't know. Completely.
I don't understand. In that, there will be 3 parts. One will go to the government. One will go to the workers. Which will be the third part?
No, it will go to 3 different governments. The NTC will keep 1/3. The BMC will get 1/3 and MHADA will get 1/3. Okay.
Oh.
And again, even in this case, what do the workers get? They get nothing. You know, I mean, the thing about the mill lands was that if the landowners, I mean, if the mill owners got 1/3 of the land, supposedly they got much more, but in theory, if they were supposed to get 1/3, why was there no share for the workers? You know, because the what was the claim of the mill owners to the land? Nothing, absolutely nothing. So if the only claim was that they had been using that land for 100 years, then that same claim should have also been applicable to the workers, but it was not. And the workers were given voluntary retirement schemes, which was basically peanuts to just ask them to go away. It was you know, I mean, most of the mill workers who had wage employment but regulated employment, they had unions, they had the ability to bargain collectively. Most of them had to eventually move to the informal sector, and in fact there was downward mobility for workers in the city. So yeah, I mean, it was actually a very sad and disheartening episode in the city's history. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so shall we stop? And we'll see you guys next week then. Yeah. The next two groups have their essays, and you know what you're doing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Next week, I think we're doing the 2 essays on evictions. So, all right. Fine. So, see you guys then. Take care, all the best, and be good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.